Here.
Boom.
All right, guys, we are live here at the Attention Era Media Studios overlooking the beautiful downtown Milwaukee. You're watching hour 15 of our 24-hour broadcasts. Live Google Hangouts covering topics, all kinds of things about community management, and really from people all around the world. That's been pretty exciting today. We are celebrating year 6 of Community Manager Appreciation Day, and also the 3rd year of us kind of hanging out and talking to people all around the world. So we'd like to give a quick special shout out to our award sponsors. So last year we started these awards. This is the 2nd year that we give away plaques and swag to a number of community managers that are nominated by their friends, their family, their bosses, things like that. So those award sponsors are, thank you to BTC Revolutions, Flockler, Higher Logic, My Community Manager, Online Community Results, socialmedia.org, and Sprout Socials. So, all right, well, we're the gang from My Community Manager. My name is Brew, co-producer at CMGR Hangout, as well as the Director of Awesome for BTC Revolutions.
Hey everyone, I'm Sherry Rohde. I lead community and user experience at Rebellion Media, and I also co-produce CMGR Hangout here with Brew.
Hey guys, I'm Dom Garrett. I am a social media freelance specialist extraordinaire, Highlander wonder kid, as well as hanging out with these wonderful, wonderful people every Friday with my community manager.
That's awesome. And if you were wondering what's over my shoulder here, this is actually the Zoomf board. And you can get on this board just by tweeting on the CMAN hashtag. So all of your tweets and rich media are going up there all day today. So I guess before we hand things over to Ben, let's have a little drum roll, shall we, for this award.
All right. The award that we're giving away is actually for the diplomat, the person that handles all interactions with tact and grace. This was the 3rd most nominations that we had out of any of our awards, so there's a lot of awesome diplomats out there. And the winner was actually a panelist last hour, Miss Sarah Hawk. So let's all give it up for Sarah Hawk, the winner. Yep. Her Twitter handle is at @ILoveTheHawk. So make sure you blow up her Twitter feed with a bunch of high five gifts because she definitely deserves it. So awesome.
Very cool. So we're going to hand things over to Ben, who will enlighten us on the topic of governance of growing open source communities. So take it away, Ben.
All right, folks. Thanks a lot for having me and having us again. I've been had the privilege of being at a few community manager hangouts before. It was really awesome to have these hangouts, and exactly we talked about this topic I think like half a year ago, and especially in the open source communities, I think it's a very dynamic topic going on here, and I would really like to kick it off with an introduction of everybody. Last time we also had David and Ruth, and David, let me start with you. Introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. So my name is David Hurley. I'm the community manager for Joomla, and I also work with the production leadership team, and I'm the founder of an open source market automation tool called Mautic. So it's a pleasure to be here yet again.
Excellent. Thank you. Martin.
Martin? Oh, sorry, me?
Yes, you.
Yeah, you said Martin, not Guy. Sorry, apologize. So hi, everybody. I'm Guy Martin, and I'm the senior strategist for Samsung's open source group. But prior to that, I did a spell at Red Hat, where I met Leslie, and did some work on helping build up Samsung's Red Hat's strategic practice around building communities and doing open source.
Thank you. Holly?
Hey, I'm Holly Ross. I'm the Executive Director at the Drupal Association. So I've been here for a couple of years, and this is my first fully formed, fully fledged, all-in open source community. So I'm definitely looking forward to learning as much as I share today.
Cool, thank you. And Leslie, just back from Australia, Florida, whatever, all around the world. So what's up with you?
Hi there, I'm Leslie Hawthorne. I am the Director of Developer Relations at Elasticsearch Incorporated. I'm also heavily involved in the communities for the Solana Software Foundation, the Privily Foundation, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Open Source Initiative, and I am very jet-lagged. So I hope to be able to provide some useful words this evening along with my fellow panelists.
Excellent. Mirko, how about you?
Hey, hello, my name is Mirko Böhm. I'm actually with the KDE community. I was one of the very early committers there and was on the board for a long time and wrote the statutes. So I kind of did community management and governance before we called it community management. It's kind of funny. And today I teach at the Technical University in Berlin about open source and intellectual property and governance aspects. And I work for the Open Invention Network, where I'm responsible for Linux system definition. Very happy to be here. Thank you very much, Ben, and I'm looking forward to our talk.
Excellent, great. Ruth?
Hi, my name is Ruth Cheesley. I'm from the UK. I'm part of the Joomla community leadership team, and my main roles there are helping with user groups around the world and also with the marketing team.
Great, excellent. So we have 2 people from the UK, 2 actually from the Netherlands, because Leslie is also from the Netherlands these days. And we've got Mirko from Germany, and Holly and Guy, you're in the States now?
Yep.
All right, excellent. So let's kick it off with our first question. And I think actually I kind of rolled into this topic in reading a few blog posts that Holly wrote about the stuff that she went through or they are going through with the leadership in the Drupal Association or the Drupal community. And she wrote some excellent articles about it. I think they made a lot of progress, but I think we are going to hear about that. And so the first question is, what pain points have you experienced during community growth?
Sorry, I'm muting myself so you wouldn't have to listen to me drink tea. Yeah, we definitely, I mean, it's interesting because the Drupal community has grown so much in the last few years, and we are very fortunate to have an incredibly global community, and that's one layer of diversity that we end up trying to work through. And then we also have a very diverse community in terms of their role with Drupal. So we have developers, we also have designers and UX folks and end users and content people. So we have that kind of diversity as well, and I think when you put it all together, it's a lot to work through. And then the last layer on top of that is that for a long time it was a completely self-governed community, and then a few years ago we dropped the association on top of the community. So exactly. Yeah, I mean, all the growth, all the diversity, and then this new layer of governance on top of everything has really led us to ask a number of questions and really just try to focus on providing, coming up together with some clarity on who does what role in all the work that we do, because that has to shift as the community changes. But how we make those changes together and how we communicate those changes, and then reevaluate them over time, that seems like an important fundamental for us to come to some agreement around, even if everyone's not totally happy with the decision, but we can agree to disagree for the sake of moving forward. So that's I think what we've been really trying to grapple with over the last year here.
Excellent. So I see Dawn also joined our little chat. Dawn, just a quick word from who you are. You also from the UK these days?
I am, yes. I just moved to the UK. So I'm Dawn Foster. So I've been doing open source community work for something like 14 years, I guess. And I'm currently at Puppet Labs, where I'm the director of community there. So I'm happy to have joined. Thank you.
Cool. So maybe you can jump in immediately. So about what Holly was saying about community growth.
I actually joined right as you were asking the question, so I missed the question. I heard her answer.
Actually, it was about it is about the pain points that we experience with community growth.
Oh yeah, of course. So I don't know. It takes a bunch of different forms. We actually had a situation when I first joined Puppet Labs, where the community was growing at a rate that was way faster than what we could actually assimilate. So what happened was we were getting a whole bunch of pull requests on our projects, and we didn't have enough engineers to actually handle those, and we didn't have enough people who were trained on the public code base to actually take those contributions. So we had this huge pile up of pull requests when I first joined, and we actually ended up putting 3 people on it full time to resolve it, and they were able actually to clear through that pull request log in maybe a couple of months or so. It was a little miserable for them though, because they did nothing but look at pull requests for like 3 months, which was not the best job for an engineer, I guess. But we did get through it. But that was kind of a painful example of the too fast growth in a particular area.
Okay, great. So who else wants to join in that question about pain points?
Well, I could speak for Joomla's perspective a little bit. We've grown quite a bit as a community, and we've gotten quite large. So I think one of the pain points that we began to experience as we got larger in size was figuring out how to relay information correctly and how to make sure that everyone was on the same page, and make sure that everybody felt like they knew what was going on and how they could be involved. And as you get larger with your community, it becomes a little bit more difficult to know kind of where each individual person fits in. So that's something that's been actually an ongoing process, and the learning experience for us is trying to organize more of a working group environment where it's easy to know exactly where to go if you want to get involved.
All right, great. Anybody else on this topic? I experienced myself in the Type 3 community that we also it's kind of the same like Holly mentions. We at a certain point we used to have a self-organized community, still have a self-organized community, and then an association gets dropped on top of it. And it's kind of like Jono mentioned Jono Bacon mentioned in an article a few days ago about marketing and community management getting a little closer. So what in our community I can definitely see is that the influence or the stakes of the companies get a lot higher. So the companies get very much dependent on our software, and this has quite a lot of influence, you know, on the companies wanting to give some kind of a direction to the product, which can lead to tension in the community, of course. So just feel free to add something to that if you want. Anybody else?
I could add something about governance. When the community grows quite quickly, inevitably there'll be some tension, and there will be situations which become uncomfortable, whether it's just through misunderstanding or miscommunication. So having a process for that, especially when you have volunteers involved, and having a way to actually proactively communicate through conflict. I think that's something that kind of sneaks up on you, and you don't realize that it's needed until you're kind of in the fire. So yeah, and then how do you actually deal with that if you've got volunteers giving their time freely?
So how's this for you, for the Joomla community? Like I mentioned, the stakes get a little higher, the influence of companies, they're more dependent on the software. How does that work with the Joomla community?
Sure. I mean, we've had quite a few incidents where there have been conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest, or there have been arguments happening on social media or what have you. And it's something that I guess clear communication is important, especially when you've got people who don't speak English as their first language. Having a process through which people can actually seek advice if they are in a situation that they are finding challenging, and we're working on kind of revisiting our code of conduct and conflict of interest policies, because they're really, really old. I mean, they date from very early in the project when social media wasn't necessarily what it is now. So kind of updating the processes so that they reflect what's happening in today's times, I guess.
Can you give us a small indication where you're going with the code of conduct? Because I think that's exactly something that we are looking at in the Type 3 community as well. Because you also see that the code of conduct that we initially adapted from the Ubuntu project is kind of old.
Part of the challenge was pretty much every open source project that we looked at was using the old Ubuntu code of conduct.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple of projects that had updated or had put in place systems, so Drupal was one and KDE was another, that we were kind of looking at how that works and would that work with our community.
And Mirko, is there something that you can say about the KDE community? Because I also saw recently that you guys or the KDE community is acquiring kind of a CEO or something. Is that something that you're still involved in or kind of watching what's going on there?
I'm watching this very curiously. For a very long time, we have basically relied on our board and on volunteers to run the organization. And it just turns out that eventually you reach a point where this such volunteer efforts are just not enough anymore. And I think we reached that point late last year, so we're now looking for an executive director. So excellent to mention this on this call, because I would like to encourage everybody who is involved in community management to look into this job offer. Yeah, we developed a code of conduct relatively early in the process. And at the time, there was still quite a number of, how do you say that, discussions about the necessity of it, because we were used to just working together quite in a friendly way. But just instances happened where people behaved in ways that others found unacceptable. I think we never had any serious problems there, but I think that our code of conduct kind of set an example as well, similar to one in Ubuntu. And I really like it because it's very friendly, if you will, and inviting, and just sets a few boundaries. So yeah, I'm quite happy we have it, similar to our manifest. I don't know if you saw that. It kind of tries to express the spirit of the community, what we're standing for. And these two things together, I think if you read these 2 pages, I think you get a pretty good understanding of what the KDE community is about. But I consider that a success.
Okay, that might be a good point to go to the second question that's on the list, and that's what's the role of governance in your community? Like I hear you, Mirko, and that also goes for I think for the Type 3 community. We can definitely see, there's a lot of self-governance. The groups are really proud that they can take care of things themselves. And on the other hand, you get some finances, some money involved. You've got an association, and people are looking for return of investment, and governance also plays a role in this. So.
Yeah, and that's a bit of a challenge. By the way, I apologize, a little technical difficulties earlier. That's a bit of a challenge in communities like Tizen, for example. So Samsung, Intel got together, created Tizen. And I always say to people that Tizen is kind of 2 communities. It's 2.0 community, which is more like Android, so not really open source per se, more source available. And then the 3.0 branch of the community is more true open source collaborative project. But I will tell you, it's a challenge for companies like Samsung and probably other big companies who are used to working in a very controlled environment to then be subject to saying, hey, I need to have my code reviewed per the terms of the rest of the governance, and that's the challenge that we fight kind of on a daily basis at Samsung, is getting engineers who aren't used to working in open source comfortable with the notion that they don't control everything in the community. They have a shared governance and a shared control of what goes on in that community.
Right. You can just take over the question if you want. So who else wants to say something about this, the role of governance?
Actually, I would like to share a little bit about the role of governance in the Solana Software Foundation, which is a disaster management platform. So the governance model for the Solana project is actually fairly interesting. We follow an Apache-style model, meaning that we have members of the Solana Software Foundation, and then we also have a board of directors who are elected from amongst the members of the foundation, and then the board elects itself. And in general, our community is largely self-governing. There isn't a lot of interference and or guidance needed from the board. We are largely there to do things like approve checks and make sure that the community is operating in a way that is overall functional. But the really great thing is, in general, we don't really need to step in. We're more there as advisors, trusted experts when questions come up or conflicts arise that need to be mitigated or adjudicated. But largely, we just can step back and be hands-off, which I think is very fortunate and speaks very well to the Apache model for community governance.
Okay, cool. Do you have in? Go ahead.
Sorry, Ben. Sorry, just to echo some of Leslie's stuff. I feel like at the association, the Drupal Association, we also have a mixed model on our board. We have community elected representatives and then board nominated appointees as well. And I think we've tried to adopt a model where a lot of the community governance of the all the social aspects is very much run by the community. There's a community working group that is appointed by community members, and all of that good stuff. They help enforce the code of conduct and deal with points of tension, et cetera. And then we also, though, have a lot of technical governance. So Drupal.org, the platform for the whole project, used to be entirely volunteer run. That is a lot where we've transitioned a lot to staff over the last 2 years in particular, to take over management of the infrastructure that helps the community go. And they certainly intersect. The way our issue queues are tooled helps reinforce certain kinds of behaviors in our community that the community working group has to hear about all the time. They definitely intersect, but that's one area where we've tried to take a step forward and provide staff and resources so that the community doesn't have to worry about sort of those mundane tasks around infrastructure, and they can really focus on innovating the product.
So how do you feel that as an association you can accommodate the community? I've seen some articles you wrote, I think, a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, we also try to incorporate, obviously, the community voice even in the work that we take on from a staff perspective. So we do have 3 community-staffed working groups that work with our staff to make the strategic decisions for the site. So there's a software working group, a content working group, and an infrastructure working group. So they work very closely with our staff and represent the community voice. So they're definitely not left out of the process. We also just chartered a licensing working group. So there's a community response to licensing issues. We help support them by, bringing in the lawyers whenever we need to detangle things, for example. But it's still the community very much engaged in those kinds of issues on a day-to-day basis with, I think, support for the expensive and expensive stuff there with the lawyers.
At what point are the lawyers brought in then? That sounds interesting.
I mean, really just for points of clarification, right? Like, can you read these 2 licenses for us and help us make a judgment, right?
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Dawn, can you say something about the governance in the Puppet Labs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the governance model that we have, I think, is a little bit different because the project is sort of governed by the company. So it's certainly a little bit different from the open source projects that are part of foundations and other organizations. But, for the most part, the company and the community, everyone works really seamlessly together. We have a pretty strong code of conduct that I almost never have to actually enforce on anyone, which is pretty awesome. And the community really tends to sort of govern themselves in a lot of cases, which is a really nice place to be. They tend to be pretty self-policing, and when somebody's getting out of control, I'll see people who don't work at the company enforcing our code of conduct on people, which is kind of nice, or sending people the link and saying, hey, this isn't cool, here's the code of conduct, here's what you should be looking at. Which is a really great place to be. It's honestly the nicest community I've ever worked within. So governance from that standpoint is quite easy compared to a lot of other projects.
Does that for you guys also involve, the governance, like giving direction to the project? I mean, this is something that's probably at Puppet Labs much better described than you have with open source projects.
Well, I can speak for KDE here, where we have a very strict separation of concerns. Some go as far as to say it's the separation of church and state, and like from the importance. Where our association has basically, very explicitly, no influence over technical direction. It's really like in the statutes where we say we handle legal matters, we handle donations, we organize a conference. But other than that, the association and the board do not take influence on the technical direction. And this is actually kind of a cornerstone of our governance, because we want the organization to be mostly volunteer-driven. We want people to have technical influence based on merit. And to me, it turns out that it's one of the very fundamental decisions we made, like very early. And I would actually like to be very interested to hear if other communities have similar experiences, or if you see maybe a conflict between like technical stewardship and community governance, or is it like going all hand in hand for you guys?
Well, the latest community I'm involved with is actually almost a hybrid of what you're describing, Mirko, which is the Open Interconnect Consortium. So OIC actually has kind of two concerns, so it's similar to the association model where we have an association, Samsung, Intel, Cisco, HP, a bunch of others, and then we have a reference implement, and the job of that association is to define the standard, the specification, and then there's an open source project called iotivity.org, which is a true Apache open source project. There is a lot of cross-pollination because people currently involved in iotivity are from member companies of OIC, but the goal is that project should be basically independent. It's funded, sourced money-wise from OIC, but it is allowed to have a different governance model, a true open source governance model, so you could technically have code in that project that doesn't make it back into the standard. So that's why I say it's kind of a hybrid in the sense that it's not truly hands-off. There is some technical direction that's given from member companies of OIC because the job of that project is to create a reference implementation, but that's not the only job. They can put additional things in that code that make sense, plug in some other things that aren't directly involved in the spec. So we'll see. We're about 9 to 10 months into this so far, so we'll see kind of what this looks like in terms of how that community develops.
Okay, cool.
Okay, anybody else wants to join in on this question? Otherwise, you jump into the next one.
Ben, I don't necessarily know if I want to jump in on that, except to say I don't know if anybody read the article on opensource.com just recently about how Linux does work, even though there's a bit of vitriol sometimes with Linux's governance model. And I actually responded to that to say, you know, I understand from the perspective of why Linux targets bad code equally, no matter who you are, but there are plenty of examples of projects, and we've talked about a couple here, where you don't have to use vitriol as a management technique. And so that's why I think, I don't know what the rest of the panel thinks about that, but I think people in the open source world always like to hold up Linux as a great example, and it is a great example, but it's not the only way that you have to manage a community.
I am a huge fan of not using vitriol as a management technique. I would suggest it's an anti-management technique. With all due respect to the Linux community, I've heard a lot of my friends who are kernel developers tell me repeatedly that other people may not understand their processes, but they clearly work for them. I have to say that the Linux code base is certainly an admirable thing. We were all using it in our daily lives. I would also say when I look at the Linux community overall, I see a great number of developers who are close to retirement, and not a lot of people rising up through the ranks to replace them. And I'm wondering how much of that may be due to the fact that the best line I've ever heard about the Linux kernel mailing list was that you do not enter without asbestos underpants. So,
absolutely right.
And I would suspect that it is more difficult to attract new contributors into your community if the bar to be met is one of meeting Linus Torvalds' quality bar. We cannot all be Linus Torvalds.
True.
I think this is kind of going back to like a circle to the actual question of role of governance, where it depends on what you want to achieve, of course. I would assume that in a community like ours, the role of governance is to raise as many contributions as you can and to attract as many contributors as you can. And well, if that's the measure, then vitriol is certainly a probably counterproductive.
Right.
So this has always been kind of the litmus test that we apply: is any action we take, is it encouraging people to join the community? Because there's always fluctuation, people will always leave, and that means you have to create a constant stream of newcomers that are interested in the project. And an open, welcoming atmosphere is probably the best thing you can get. And we've always strived for that, and I think we've done well.
I think so too. All right, let's hit on question number 3. And that's success of a project depends on strong, sustained leadership. How do you execute this? So this is really ties in very neatly to the previous question and the following discussion.
Well, I think it actually ties in very neatly because, you know, Leslie gave a great example of Linux community, right? If you have a dearth of people who are rising up because of whatever, you know, is going on in that community, you're going to have a hard time continuing to drive innovation and leadership. And that was kind of on Facebook, I responded to this article on opensource.com, and I said, you know, right now, Linux is very lucky in that the number of people that are willing to put up with that vitriol is high enough to keep innovation in that project going and to keep things working from a leadership perspective. What happens when you get to a point where that's no longer the case? Then you have challenges. And so I think, you know, to Mirko's point and to Leslie's point, you have to have a model that encourages people to get involved and gives them a path. Jono talks about this all the time, right? Ramps to success in communities. You've got to give people a ramp so that they can see how they're going to progress in that community and continue to grow in that community into leadership positions where they have a say in what goes on.
Yeah, I think it's still remarkable to see, you know, that you've got this difference, you know, between people who are really good, like Linus, and the newcomers in the project. I found in my own community, we also had these problems, you know, where you really have people that are very good at something, and it's, especially in the open source community, it's very difficult to remove people like this.
Then I feel like that's an entirely different hangout.
Yeah, I think on every question we can have a total an hour, a hangout of an hour.
Yeah.
Well, it's also a question. To me, it's not a given. I mean, strong leadership, for example, if you would go into KDE and you would say, oh, governance, the people involved in governance are providing strong leadership, you would probably raise a few eyebrows if you would put it like that. Yeah. Because the purpose of governance is more of guidance and of like a helpful hand. And of course you can say a helpful hand and guidance is, in the end, strong leadership. If you want to phrase it like that, I'm okay with it. But other than that, I would assume that many contributors are a bit averse to authority, bit average maybe, and then saying strong leadership is like in the sense of being successful as a community may also be detrimental. I personally prefer if leadership kind of leads by example and maybe tries to tone it down a bit in terms of setting direction. And so yeah, it might just be the way your community is set up. If you have more volunteers, my argument may be stronger. If you have more companies involved, then they might prefer stronger leadership in terms of direction.
I think, too, the leadership depends a lot on how the initial project was structured. I think in a lot of cases where we're sort of stuck with some of the leaders, I mean, I think the Linux kernel is an extremely successful project. It succeeds despite Linus, I think, probably, not necessarily, or, you know, despite some of his behavior, not necessarily because of, you know, talking about the vitriol again. And then in other cases, you know, in our case for Puppet Labs, the original code base was written by Luke Kitties, our CEO, and he still is pretty involved in the project. He still chimes in on the developer mailing list, you know, despite the fact that we have 340, 50 employees, he still chimes in on the developer mailing list on architectural questions. So he's still very heavily involved in the product. So, you know, in our case, we sort of lucked out because the leader's pretty awesome. But I think in a lot of cases, based on based on how the project started, that's sort of where the leadership gets determined, at least initially.
I think it's also a thing to recognize that there's leadership opportunities all over the project in a variety of ways, and that depending on the project, leadership in governance may or may not be a good thing, but you need leaders to lead all sorts of little initiatives or contributed projects, and anyway, you need leadership at a variety of different levels because someone at the end of the day, we have to make a decision, right? And someone needs to help the group make a decision, whether it's a big giant question or something much smaller. And I just I think that it is key that sort of on-ramping and showing people where they can find those leadership opportunities is really, really important, and that's something that the Drupal community really tries to do a lot of. We also undermine our own best efforts in a lot of ways, but but I do think that that is really key to show. We put a great emphasis on the fact that you don't just have to be a developer to be a leader in the community. There are documentation opportunities. There are on-the-ground opportunities to lead community events of all various shapes and sizes. You could be a trainer. I mean, there's just lots of ways that folks can find a space and a voice in the project, and highlighting all those different opportunities is something that's been really important to us. And just one small example, at each of the DrupalCons, we will have a day of sprinting. They used to be called the code sprint days, but now they're contribution sprints. And there are events set up within those sprint days that have nothing to do with writing code, which I think is a pretty important message to send. We keep trying to send messages like that.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I think that's a really good point, and I think that user groups are an excellent way for people to jump in and show leadership in a project, because you can hold a user group in your relatively small city that I've never heard of, and it can be incredibly successful, and that's a great way to kind of step into a leadership role.
I actually think that the most interesting thing is the thing that I've taken away the most from this question is actually the word sustained, because I think everyone on this panel is quite familiar with the concept of community manager burnout. And as we're talking through the need to make it very clear to our community members the different ways that they can contribute, I think that the most important practice of having strong, sustained leadership is being able to effectively delegate, because there is no way that only one leader in your project can sustain all the things. So it is really important to make those on-ramping paths clear and to make explicit asks to people to do particular things where you think that they would be well served in terms of their interests and the project would be well served in terms of their talent.
I think it's also important that there is an awareness that we are human and we have lives outside of these communities and things change. So not being fearful about the fact that one day your leaders may not be leaders, but actually actively planning for that. So making sure that that the processes your leaders are putting in place are documented, and that there is a process you can go through to kind of hand over to someone else, because that also empowers people to work and delegate and share responsibilities, but it also puts your key roles at less risk, I guess. If someone was just to be hit by a bus or something, then it's shared by more people, and you've actually got a plan for that.
I think it's also really important in companies that are paying people to contribute, and I look specifically at Samsung. We have this issue where people can be transferred at the drop of a hat, and I'm still trying to get the rest of Samsung to understand that when you're participating in open source, you can't just transfer somebody without having a plan for who's going to take over that work, or you lose that ability to influence as a company. And so what we've been saying, and I've done a ton of trainings internally in a year and a half at Samsung, and we always say exactly what you're saying. Have a plan. If your goal as a company is to contribute and have influence, make sure you have a plan for what happens if that person that's contributing gets transferred, right? Are they mentoring somebody along at the same time? And I think that's more generally applicable to all communities, regardless of whether you're contributing as a company or as an individual contributor. Figure out who's going to be there to take over when eventually you get transferred, or God forbid, as Ruth says, get hit by a bus.
Yeah. I think also the role as a community manager, I said this at the presentation last year in one of the TYPO3 meetings, is to create other community managers. That's one of your tasks as a community manager. All right, let's go to question 4, and we kind of talked about this already. In your community, what is the role of your association foundation in leadership? Mirko said something about this. Is this something that somebody wants to say something explicitly about? Maybe Holly, that's something for you that you can say something about. One of your articles was really interesting about this.
Let's see if I remember what I said that was interesting to you. But that is a really good question. And so for the association in Drupal, we also have a very clear mandate that we don't influence the project, right? So what features are going to be included, what it looks like, we don't get involved in those decisions. But we do help the Drupal community build Drupal and also help them promote Drupal. So those are the roles that we try to fulfill for them. And that really looks like, again, like maintaining and improving Drupal.org and all of the tooling that's required for these various parts of the community to work together. And then also providing things like, a brand for the next version of Drupal, managing PR around the release that, is about to happen, and, all of those kinds of things that we do to help make sure that, the world is aware that it exists and that they use it to increase adoption. So we take on those roles, but because, again, like historically, all of that has been managed by the community, we just time and time again bumped up into this tension of, is that you or is that me? And I think we're really working hard with the community to recognize those points of tension when we bump into them, to also not treat that as a negative experience, right? Like when we find that point of tension, to recognize it as an exciting place where like we grew and something had to change, and this is our opportunity to shape it the right way, right? And have the conversation about where volunteering begins, or volunteering ends, and staffing might begin. So over the last year, we've just had those conversations time and time again, and have been really working hard to help the community see those as a natural part of growth, as opposed to a problem that has to be overcome.
Exactly. I think the keyword conversation is key here, so to speak. Anybody else on association, foundation?
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate a little bit of what I said, the challenge I have in something like Open Interconnect Consortium, as it's brand new, is that the open source project's remit is to build a reference implementation of the standard. But again, they have a piece of that is not directly related to the standard. So I actually look at it as a way for that to be kind of an innovation ground for what goes on in this Open Interconnect standard. So things that aren't necessarily part of the specification can go into that project. And I think the goal we all have in OIC is that it's almost a place where if companies want to potentially join the association, it's a place they can sort of try before they buy, right? They can get involved in the community, see if it makes sense, have the normal meritocratic process work, where if they think something is important and the rest of the community thinks it's important, it goes into the project. But I totally get that there's we have a very different model than Drupal and Holly's case, in that there is a lot of cross-pollination, and so I won't say technical direction is set from the OIC consortium, but it is in the sense that you've got people who are part of member companies working on that. I think my goal in that is that it eventually grows to be people who maybe aren't part of the association contributing actively just because it makes sense for what they want to do with that open source code base.
Cool, thank you. So we have 10 minutes left, and Leslie specifically requests that we get into number 5. How should we handle complaints and conflict effectively while giving people a voice, being transparent, and bringing resolution and satisfactory outcomes? This is something for a specific hangout. We can do a whole hour about this. Leslie, go ahead.
First of all, total +1 to this as a separate hangout, just this topic. So I think that the most important thing is to ensure that your community has a very clearly stated set of agreed upon goals. This may be formed via your code of conduct. This may be due to your mission statement. But when you're dealing with conflict, the most important thing that you can do is to bring all of your contributors back to those stated goals and just ask, how are we meeting our goals dependent upon what the perspectives are in that conflict? And I could pontificate about this ad nauseum, but I won't. The most important message I can give to folks is, and this is not always a popular opinion, it is okay to ask people to leave your community if they are behaving in a manner that it is disruptive, abrasive, and contrary to the stated goals of your community. It's an uncomfortable process, but sometimes you just have to let folks who may mean well but who are not capable of putting the goals of the community first. Sometimes you have to let those folks go and wish them well in their quest, just not within your community.
Now I can relay here that we had a very long discussion about exactly this topic about a year ago, and the special problem we have is we have a community working group that is like kind of tries to collaboratively handle conflict and deal with the different sides. And one of the questions was, of course, what kind of instruments does this community working group get? And it was a huge debate, and in the end, one of the principles we set is that we will never excommunicate somebody for good. We will suspend accounts or access, but always for a limited time, and then allow people to come back, and if they do it again, well, then it's a bit longer of a time. So we try to always apply kind of a tit-for-tat strategy where you hit it back hard, but you always allow them to come back in. Try to make it a learning process instead of an excommunication. Luckily, we had only very few cases where we had to apply such instruments at all. But I think it's really important to keep in mind everybody makes mistakes, and sometimes people argue very heatedly only because they care about the product and what you're creating. And so the conflict itself might actually be the symptom of just heatedly working together. And in such a case, it's good to just leave the doors just closed for a while and then open it again.
Yeah, we have a pretty well-defined process for handling issues, and it really does start with education. Like the first one is what we call the first strike, and that's a message to that person with the code of conduct saying, hey, this is what you did. And then the next one is sort of, hey, this is what you did. Really, it's not good. If you do this again, we're going to kick you out. And then the third time is, getting kicked out of the community. And then there is a forgiveness period, so people can come back eventually. But this is all extremely well documented, so that if somebody screws up, they get a couple of chances to correct their behavior. And we try to make it very clear to them exactly what they did and what was wrong and how to improve it.
David, do you want to jump into this one?
I just don't think I have enough time to give all of my thoughts on the subject.
Oh, just a minute.
I think it's very important that things be done openly and transparently, and I think that if we can clearly communicate what's expected of people beforehand, then it makes it that much easier to enforce later. And I think that's what's going to make a real difference in keeping that satisfaction level, regardless of the outcome, as high as possible. So if we can clearly outline the guidelines and the rules for the community, I think that's going to definitely help the overall understanding of transparency among the different people when things come up that have to be handled.
So we also started the community working group a few months ago, I think, or half a year ago. I'm really looking forward to work with that, because I find in my own community, and I think you can see this in a lot of other communities, that people are very goal-oriented. So they're very working towards the product is going to be, and so the other social aspects kind of are left behind. I'm trying to work on diversity and stuff like this, and sometimes it's very difficult, to get into these kind of topics. Maybe it's kind of like the strategy Linus has, we just want to work on the kernel and everybody shut up. So anybody else on conflict resolution? It's an interesting topic. I think definitely we'll do my community hangout in a few months about this?
Yeah, I would just add kind of what everybody else said, which is that if you have no conflict, the chances are you probably don't have a lot of passionate people working on it. I mean, anytime you've got passionate people that are really good at what they do, there's bound to be conflict. And so I think everyone laid out some really great ways to deal with that, but I would just look at it from the perspective of if there's no conflict, I'm worried that there's nothing getting done.
Exactly. Good point. I always say assume best intent. You know, when somebody is really being nasty, then I always try to look behind that. So transparency. Anybody?
Yeah, just listening to folks, I think the other thing that really struck me is like you obviously want to embrace open source values, and you're in dealing with the community. At the same time, you're dealing with people, and sometimes with issues that maybe aren't best fit for public consumption. So I think there's a real challenge to find the right way to incorporate one-on-one kinds of conversations in that kind of conflict resolution in a way that also allows for sort of a public report out, if not discussion. And there's a real there's a tension between those two things that's kind of hard to resolve.
All right, thanks. Let's go to 6. We've got 2 questions left that we can quickly go through. I think we've got 4 minutes left. How can we build bridges between our communities is number 6. I think the mere fact that we are here already shows that we are building bridges. I mean, there's quite a lot of people that I already know. Maybe somebody wants to jump into this one. How can we cooperate more closely? Or are we already doing this? Oh, Dawn, you want to say something? I can see that.
I can say something. I think there's a lot to be said just for networking with other community managers. So I find that, I think people like Leslie, for example, because I've known her for years, when there's community stuff coming up, or, say when I'm leaving Puppet Labs and I'm looking for suggestions for, who might replace me, things like that. I do talk to a lot of other community managers, and a lot of it's just built on the relationships for, meeting new people over time.
That's why I was so happy that Leslie moved to Amsterdam. That was much easier to talk to her.
Yeah, no, I would just echo what Don says, right? I mean, some of us I know are involved in Community Roundtable, for example, because I think having a community of community managers that can deal with some of these issues, and like Leslie, or like Don, I ping Leslie, I ping Don, they're Jono, they're fortunately or unfortunately a limited number of us kind of working in this space, so most of the time we all sort of know each other. So I think that forms, for me, the bridge between these different communities is sort of how we talk to each other and end up working on problems.
Great, thanks. So last one, we've got 2 minutes left, and I think it's a good one, a few seconds for everybody. What lessons have we learned in open source that we do not have to learn the hard way again? So what's the best takeaway you've had these last few years?
It's not the tools you use, it's the people in your community.
Thank you, David.
I'll say something, I guess. Show appreciation. Make sure that people understand the importance and value of what they're doing, and sometimes all it takes is a tweet or an email, or if you have the opportunity, a verbal showing of appreciation. That goes miles with people.
Excellent.
Well, Leslie stole mine because it is totally all about the people. But I do think that one of the other big things that I've learned is that it's, you can't know everything. These communities are incredibly large, they're incredibly complex, and there's a lot to be said for knowing the right people that you can go to for questions about specific things, because there are going to be a lot of things that you just aren't going to know.
Right, that kind of traffic cop role as a community manager, of knowing exactly what you don't know and who you can put together to potentially figure that problem out.
Cool, thank you. A last word, somebody. Famous last word. Holly?
I was just thinking about the word generosity, if there's a last word, because the community is so generous with their time and energy, and I think generosity in terms of reciprocating that generosity with thank yous and all the things that we need to do there, but also being generous with my interpretation of everyone's intent, right? Like, it's really tough to get, sometimes you get a scathing email and you're like, what a jerk. But then you remember, oh, English is your second language, and when you said demand, it's because you're French, and demander translates it that way for you, but you're not actually demanding it of me. Okay, right? So really trying to be generous with everyone's intent is a key thing that I've been working on in the last few months.
Excellent, thanks.
I think real quick for me, it's understanding, to Holly's point, understanding sometimes the intent is not driven by the individual, it's driven by their company. And it's a challenge. Like I said, in an environment like Samsung, I have that challenge all the time, is getting our developers to understand that just because their VP says, I want X, Y, Z, that doesn't necessarily translate to what the community wants, and helping them sort of do a better job of communicating so Holly doesn't get those kinds of emails.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, guys. This was a fantastic panel. You guys absolutely crushed it. Really, really appreciate it. And there's, like what Ben said, this is a panel that we could take just one question of, make an entire another hangout down the road, and that's definitely something that I know that we're going to do. So
we'll keep to that.
Very much.
Yeah. So coming up next is the power of programs to drive engagement in your community. So guys, if you want to continue watching, head over to cmad.co, click on the broadcast schedule, find the next time slot, and check it out. So hopefully we'll see you over there. Bye. Happy Community Manager Appreciation Day,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.